Last summer, I found myself back in the countryside, staying at my grandmother's old cottage during my summer break. The place was a weathered relic, standing stubbornly against time with its creaky floorboards and faded wallpaper. It was the kind of house that invited stories, old, mysterious, and full of whispered secrets. I was there with Sarah, my childhood friend who shared my fascination with the supernatural. We'd spent countless afternoons swapping ghost stories under the dappled shade of the ancient oak trees behind the house. Sarah was the curious sort, always eager to chase after the unknown, and that summer, we decided to explore the cottage more thoroughly than ever before. One late afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the wooden floor, we ventured into the attic. The narrow staircase groaned under our weight, and the air was thick with dust and the scent of aged wood. The attic had always been off-limits, a place filled with forgotten relics and covered furniture. We'd never dared linger there, but that day, the pull of curiosity was stronger than caution. The light from our flashlights danced across old trunks, moth-eaten blankets, and stacks of yellowed books. As we moved deeper in, a sudden flicker caught my eye. An old oil lamp hanging from a rafter seemed to pulse gently, as if breathing. I nudged Sarah, and she nodded, her face pale but excited. Moments later, a faint whisper floated through the stale air, so soft it was almost swallowed by the silence. We paused, straining to listen, but the words were unintelligible, more like sighs carried on the breeze than human voices. At first, we told ourselves it was the house settling, the wind sneaking through cracks, or our imaginations playing tricks. But as the minutes passed, the whispers grew clearer, more urgent, weaving through the shadows like a slow, mournful chant. A chill crept along my spine, and I noticed Sarah's breath misting slightly in the cooled air. Then, barely visible near the attic window, a shadow shifted. It was faint, almost blending with the darkness, but it had shape, a tall figure standing still, watching us. Neither of us moved. The room seemed to hold its breath. Our excitement waned, replaced by a creeping unease that tightened like a noose. The shadow didn't advance or retreat, it simply lingered, a silent observer in the gloom. I wanted to speak, to ask who or what it was, but my voice caught in my throat. Sarah's eyes were wide, locked on the figure. We stood frozen, the attic suddenly feeling impossibly vast and empty at once. The air grew heavier, thick with something unseen, pressing against us from all sides. After what felt like an eternity, the figure vanished, dissolving into the darkness as if it had never been there. The whispers faded with it, leaving a ringing silence that buzzed in our ears. We hurried down the stairs, the wooden steps groaning beneath our haste, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere. Outside, the fresh air was a balm, but the unease clung stubbornly, like a shadow that refused to fade. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the wind rustle through the trees, I kept replaying the attic encounter in my mind. The house, with all its creaks and sighs, felt alive somehow, watching, waiting. Sarah and I exchanged texts, both restless and unable to shake the feeling that something was there, just beyond the veil of the ordinary. The next day was clouded by a restless energy. We avoided the attic, instead wandering the grounds, trying to distract ourselves. But the whispers from the night before echoed faintly in the back of my mind. As evening approached, we found ourselves drawn back to the cottage, unable to resist the pull of the mysterious. That evening, the sun dipped low, casting the garden in gold and shadow. We sat on the porch, the old wooden swing creaking softly in the breeze. Our conversation was quiet, punctuated by occasional glances toward the attic window, now shuttered against the coming night. Suddenly, a cold gust swept through, carrying with it that same faint whispering. This time, it was clearer, words almost intelligible, like a secret language just beyond comprehension. Then, movement caught our eyes near the edge of the yard, a flicker of shadow darting between the trees. Sarah grabbed my arm, her grip tight. "Did you see that?" she whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding. The day's unease had returned full force, settling deep in my chest. We decided to retreat indoors, locking the doors behind us. As we tried to focus on lighter things, books, music, the hum of the radio, the whispering continued, faint but persistent, threading through the house like a restless spirit. That night, sleep was elusive. Every creak of the house, every distant rustle outside, seemed amplified. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining the shadowy figure watching from the attic, waiting for us to return. By morning, the cottage felt different, not just old and creaky, but charged with something ancient and sorrowful. Sarah and I exchanged a look, unspoken but understood. We had crossed a threshold, glimpsed something not meant for daylight. And yet, the pull of the unknown was strong. We promised each other we'd return to explore further, despite the fear that nipped at our heels. The house and its shadows were no longer just a backdrop for summer stories, they were a living mystery, waiting to be unraveled. The next evening, Sarah and I decided to escape the oppressive stillness of the cottage by heading down to the nearby lake. It was a quiet spot, surrounded by dense woods where the sunlight filtered through the leaves, dappling the water's surface with gold. We hoped that the fresh air and the gentle lapping of waves might wash away the lingering unease from the attic and the whispered voices that haunted our minds. The sun was just dipping below the horizon as we pushed off from the shore in an old rowboat my grandmother kept tied to a rickety dock. The air was cool but not cold, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. The lake stretched wide and dark before us, its surface smooth like glass, reflecting the deepening shades of twilight. We settled into the boat, letting it drift slowly away from the shore. The silence between us was comforting, a quiet reprieve from the day's strange happenings. For a while, the only sounds were the occasional call of a distant bird and the soft splash of oars as I dipped them into the water. But as the last light faded and the sky turned a deep indigo, the atmosphere shifted. A sudden chill descended, wrapping around us like a damp cloak. The air grew heavy, and an inexplicable tension tightened the space between the trees and the water. Then, across the lake, a figure appeared, a woman dressed in white, standing motionless at the water's edge. Her dress billowed slightly in the breeze, but her form was blurred, almost translucent. Her head was bowed, and from where we sat, we could hear the faintest sound of sobbing carried across the water. Sarah's breath caught. "Do you see that?" she whispered, gripping my arm. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. The woman's presence was otherworldly, haunting in the fading light. As we watched, the air around us grew colder still, and the boat began to drift, as if tugged by an unseen hand, slowly moving against the gentle current. The sobbing grew louder, echoing across the lake and mingling with the rustle of the trees. The light around the woman shimmered, and for a moment, I thought I saw her lift her head, revealing hollow eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness. Sarah shivered. "I remember the stories," she said quietly. "About the woman who drowned here decades ago. They say her spirit still mourns, searching for something lost." We both fell silent, the weight of the legend settling heavily between us. The boat's movement became more pronounced, drifting farther from the shore despite our attempts to steer back. The cold seeped through our clothes, chilling us to the bone. "Maybe we should go," I murmured, glancing nervously at the ghostly figure. But before we could react, the woman's form began to fade, dissolving into the mist that was creeping steadily across the lake. The sobbing ceased abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The boat finally settled, and the temperature slowly rose as the mist thinned. We rowed back to shore in near silence, both shaken by the encounter. As we landed, the trees seemed to close in around us, their branches whispering secrets in the wind. Back on solid ground, we hurried to the car, the lake's haunting presence lingering in our minds. The local legend suddenly felt all too real, the story of the drowned woman no longer just a tale but a tangible, terrifying experience. That night, lying in my bed, I could still hear the echo of her sobs, the chill of the lake's mist, and the sight of those hollow eyes staring through the darkness. The boundary between myth and reality had blurred, and I knew that whatever haunted the lake was connected somehow to the shadows in the cottage. We both agreed to be more cautious but couldn't deny the strange allure of the unknown pulling us deeper into its grip. The summer was far from over, and the mysteries of the lake and the house were only beginning to reveal themselves. A few weeks after our unsettling night at the lake, I found myself taking a seasonal job at the Hollow Creek Inn, a historic place not far from where my grandmother's cottage stood. The inn was a sprawling, old Victorian building with ivy crawling up its stone walls and gabled windows that seemed to watch over the town. It had a reputation for being haunted, a detail that both intrigued and unnerved me. The locals shared stories, ghostly apparitions, unexplained noises, and sudden cold spots. I wasn't sure if I believed in all of it, but after everything Sarah and I had experienced, I was more open to the possibility. The first few days were quiet enough. I worked as a desk clerk, greeting guests and managing reservations. The inn was charming, with creaky wooden floors and antique furnishings that whispered of another era. But it didn't take long before strange things began to happen. Guests complained of doors slamming shut on their own, sometimes in the middle of the night. staff whispered about cold spots that seemed to freeze the air in certain hallways. I started noticing small things too, objects slightly out of place, a fleeting glimpse of something just beyond my line of sight. The most unsettling were the footsteps. I'd hear them echoing down the corridors when no one else was around, soft but deliberate, as if someone was pacing or searching. One afternoon, while helping clean the common areas, I caught sight of a figure in the hallway. He was dressed in Victorian-era clothing, a dark suit with a waistcoat and a pocket watch chain glinting in the dim light. His hair was neatly combed, and his expression was somber. For a moment, he stood perfectly still, staring down the hallway with hollow eyes that seemed to look right through me. Then, without a sound, he vanished as if swallowed by the wall itself. I blinked, unsure if my mind was playing tricks. But the chill that ran down my spine told me it was real. That night, I stayed late at the inn, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever haunted the place. The old building creaked and groaned around me, shadows stretching long and dark. I wandered the halls, flashlight in hand, feeling the weight of unseen eyes watching from the corners. In the east wing, I noticed a door slightly ajar. The room beyond was empty except for a dusty armchair and a small table covered in faded photographs. As I stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath fogged in the air, and the hairs on my arms stood on end. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me, slow and measured. I spun around, but no one was there. The footsteps continued, growing louder, then fading away into silence. My heart pounded, and I struggled to steady my breathing. Later, as I made my way back to the front desk, I felt something brush past me, a cold, fleeting touch like a whisper of air. I glanced over my shoulder but saw nothing except the dim corridor stretching empty behind me. The next day, several guests mentioned seeing a man in old-fashioned clothes wandering the halls. Some said he appeared near the grand staircase, others near the library. None could explain why he seemed so sad, or why his eyes looked empty and distant. I began to piece together stories from old newspapers and town records. The inn had been built in the late 1800s by a wealthy family, and legend had it that a tragic event had stained its history. But the details were murky, lost beneath layers of time and rumor. One evening, as I locked up, I heard a soft tapping at the window. I looked up to see the silhouette of the Victorian man standing just outside, his face barely visible in the moonlight. His eyes met mine, hollow and accusing, and then he vanished. I was left alone with the creaking walls and the weight of the past pressing down around me. The hollow creaking was no longer just a job or a building. It was a place caught between worlds, haunted by memories that refused to fade. And I was caught in the middle, a reluctant witness to the restless spirits that walked its halls. A few days after that eerie encounter at the inn, I found myself assigned to clean the basement. It was a dim, musty space beneath the old building, filled with cobwebs and the scent of damp stone. I hadn't been eager to go down there. The place felt heavy, like the air itself was thick with memories, but duty called, and I needed the job. The basement was cluttered with crates and old furniture covered in dust sheets. As I moved things aside, my flashlight caught something unusual, a narrow, weathered door concealed behind a stack of wooden boxes. It was easy to miss, blending seamlessly into the stone wall. Curiosity tugged at me despite a growing sense of unease. I hesitated, then pulled the door open. The hinges creaked, revealing a small room coated in a thick layer of dust. The air was colder here, almost biting. Inside, I found a collection of old photographs, yellowed papers, and personal items carefully arranged on a rickety table. The photographs showed people from another time, men and women dressed in Victorian clothing, their faces solemn, their eyes haunting. One picture caught my attention, a family portrait with a man who looked eerily familiar, the same figure I had seen wandering the inn's halls. His gaze seemed to follow me as I moved. As I examined the items, a cold breeze stirred the papers, despite the closed door and lack of windows. The room grew darker, shadows deepening in the corners. Then came the faintest sound, a soft, sorrowful cry echoing from somewhere deep within the stone walls. A shiver ran down my spine. The feeling of being watched intensified, as if unseen eyes were fixated on me. I took a step back, flashlight trembling in my hand, and caught a shadow moving near the entrance. Panic surged. I didn't wait to investigate. I bolted from the room, slamming the door shut behind me and sliding the bolt into place. The weight of what I'd glimpsed settled heavily on me. This small, hidden space was more than a forgotten storage room, it was a shrine to the past, a place where restless spirits lingered. I hurried upstairs, breathing hard, determined to put as much distance between myself and that secret room as possible. But the echoes of those cries and the cold presence stayed with me long after I left the basement. That night, I lay awake imagining the lives of those in the photographs, their joys, their sorrows, and the tragedy that bound them to the inn. I realized that the shadows haunting the halls were tethered to this hidden space, a secret kept locked away beneath the building. The discovery changed everything. The inn was not just a place haunted by vague presences but a home to spirits trapped by history and pain. And I was no longer just an observer, I was now entwined in their story, drawn deeper into the mystery of Hollow Creek Inn. Determined to understand the restless spirits tied to the Hollow Creek Inn, I spent the next few days digging through old records, newspapers, and town archives. The fragments I uncovered painted a grim picture. Decades ago, the inn had been the scene of a tragic murder-suicide, carried out in that very secret room I had discovered in the basement. The man in the photographs, Edward Holloway, the inn's original owner, had killed his wife and then himself, leaving a wound that seemed to have ripped through time, binding their tortured souls to the inn. Armed with this knowledge, I knew I had to confront whatever lingered there. One night, after the inn had settled into silence, I returned to the basement, flashlight and recorder in hand, steeling myself against the fear gnawing at my resolve. The house felt charged, as if it anticipated my return. I unlocked the hidden door and stepped inside the cramped room. The stale air wrapped around me, colder than before. I placed the photographs and papers on the table and began speaking aloud, hoping to communicate with the spirits trapped here. Edward Holloway, if you are here, we want to understand. We want to help. At first, nothing but silence. Then, the temperature plummeted suddenly, my breath misting in front of me. The faint cries I had heard before swelled into anguished wails echoing through the stone walls. The room began to shake, dust falling from the ceiling as unseen forces stirred. Ghostly figures materialized around me, the men from the photographs, his eyes hollow and desperate, and a woman beside him, her face etched with sorrow. Their voices overlapped in frantic whispers, pleading and accusing, caught in an endless torment. The floor trembled beneath my feet as the spirit's unrest unleashed its fury. I gripped my flashlight tightly, struggling to keep my composure as the room seemed to collapse inward, the air thick with grief and rage. Realizing the danger, I retreated swiftly, stumbling out of the room and slamming the door behind me. The violent shaking ceased immediately, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. Outside the basement, my heart pounded as I leaned against the cold stone wall, catching my breath. The inn was scarred by this haunting, its walls steeped in sorrow that refused to fade. Back at home, safe from the oppressive atmosphere of Hollow Creek Inn, I reflected on the thin line separating the living from the dead. The experience had changed me, exposing a world where pain and history intertwine, and where some stories are more than just tales, they are terrifyingly real.